My name is Hassan Rahman, and I am one of the few Muslims living in Taiwan. For most of my life, I've never thought that being a Muslim in a country where Islam is a small minority would become such an important part of my story. I was born and raised in Taiwan, built my career as a commercial pilot, married the woman I loved, raised a family, and lived what I considered a quiet and respectable life. I had no idea that one ordinary flight would eventually make me question everything I thought I understood about life, death, and Jesus. I was 38 years old when the incident happened. By then, I had been flying professionally for more than a decade. My life revolved around schedules, checklists, airports, weather reports, fuel calculations, and the countless small details that passengers never think about. I loved the discipline of flying. There was something satisfying about sitting in the cockpit, looking at thousands of feet of open sky, and knowing that hundreds of people had placed their lives in your hands. Outside the cockpit, I was simply Hassan. My wife's name is Grace. Together we have 2 children, an aging mother, cousins scattered across different parts of Taiwan, and a small circle of friends I had known since university. My weekends were usually nothing extraordinary. Sometimes we would visit my wife's parents, sometimes we would eat together at a small restaurant near our neighborhood, and on quieter evenings, I would sit on the balcony with a cup of tea while my children argued about something completely unimportant. My wife, Grace, was a Christian. That had never been a serious problem between us. When we first started dating, we talked about religion openly. She knew I was Muslim, and I knew she was Christian. We didn't agree on everything, but we respected each other. We had learned very early in our marriage that love sometimes means allowing another person to hold beliefs different from yours. Of course, Grace sometimes tried to convince me to become a Christian. She never forced me. She would leave her Bible on the dining table, send me Bible verses when she thought I was going through a difficult day, or tell me about something she had prayed about. Sometimes she would ask, almost jokingly, "Hassan, when are you finally going to read the Bible properly?" And I would laugh. I would tell her, "Grace, I'm already a Muslim. You married me knowing that." She would smile and answer, "I know, I'm just praying for you." I didn't think much of those conversations at the time. I believed in Allah. I prayed. I observed the practices that mattered to me. I wasn't the kind of man who spent every waking hour discussing religion, but my faith was part of my identity. It was something I had inherited from my family and carried with me into adulthood. My mother was especially protective of that part of me. She wasn't a woman who liked arguments, but whenever religion came up, she became serious. She would remind me that our family had remained Muslim despite living in a society where Christianity, Buddhism, Taoism, and other beliefs were much more visible around us. My father had passed away several years earlier, so my mother had become even more important to me. Whenever I had a long flight schedule, she would call and ask whether I had eaten properly. She never cared about the technical details of my work. To her, I was still the little boy who used to come home from school with dirty shoes. My children also knew that their mother was Christian and their father was Muslim. We never made religion a battlefield inside our home. Grace took them to church sometimes, while I taught them about my own beliefs. We had disagreements, of course, like every family does, but we tried not to turn those disagreements into hatred. Thinking about it right now, I realize how ordinary my life was. That is what makes what happened so difficult for me to explain. There was no warning that I was about to experience something extraordinary. I wasn't searching for Jesus. I wasn't secretly planning to become a Christian. I wasn't unhappy with my marriage or my career. In fact, I remember thinking that I had finally reached the stage of life where everything was beginning to make sense. Then came the flight. It was supposed to be routine. I had flown similar routes countless times. The weather reports had been checked. The aircraft had been inspected. The crew knew their responsibilities, and the passengers had no reason to believe anything unusual was about to happen. As we climbed higher and higher, I remember looking through the cockpit window and seeing the clouds beneath us. The aircraft eventually reached approximately 37,000 feet. At that altitude, everything below looked impossibly small. I remember thinking about my wife. I remember wondering whether Grace had already put the children to bed, and then, without warning, something happened that changed my life forever. An alarm sounded in the cockpit. At first, I thought it was a problem we could handle. Then another warning appeared, and another. Within moments, the calm atmosphere inside the cockpit disappeared. My training took over. My hands moved almost automatically as I began working through the emergency procedures with the other pilot. We communicated with air traffic control. We checked the instruments. We tried to understand exactly what was happening. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a thought appeared that I had never allowed myself to think while flying. What if we don't make it? I pushed the thought away. I was a pilot. I was supposed to remain calm. But then I looked at the instruments again. And this time, I knew we were in serious trouble. I noticed the sound first. It wasn't loud enough to frighten anyone in the cabin, but inside the cockpit, that warning tone immediately got my attention. I had heard thousands of alarms during training and throughout my career. Some meant very little. Others meant you had seconds to make the right decision. This one made me sit up straight. I looked across at my co-pilot. We didn't need to say much to each other. His expression told me he understood the seriousness of the situation. I reached for the controls and began working through the procedures we had practiced so many times that they had almost become muscle memory. My voice remained calm, even though my heart was beating much faster than it should have. Let's take this one step at a time. The aircraft was still moving forward, but something didn't feel right. The instruments were giving us information faster than we could process it. One warning was followed by another, and then another. We started losing some of the systems we normally depended on. I tried contacting air traffic control. Nothing. I tried again. Still nothing. For a few seconds, I wondered whether the communication equipment itself had failed. I adjusted the frequency and tried once more. There was only static. That was the moment the situation became real to me. We were thousands of feet above the ground, surrounded by darkness and clouds, and suddenly we were struggling to communicate with the people who were supposed to be guiding us. I remember looking at the other pilot and saying, "We have a problem." He nodded. Neither of us laughed. Neither of us made a joke. That silence between two experienced pilots told me more than words could have. I had always believed that the most difficult part of being a pilot was learning how to control an aircraft. I was wrong. The hardest part was keeping your mind clear when everything around you was telling you to panic. My hands were steady, but my thoughts were moving rapidly. I thought about my wife. I thought about my children. My daughter had called me before the flight. She had complained that I was going away again and asked me how many days I would be gone. I had teased her and told her that pilots didn't have the luxury of choosing their schedules. She had responded, "Then quit and stay home." I laughed when she said it. Now, thousands of feet above the ground, that little conversation came back to me with painful clarity. I could hear her voice in my head. For the first time, I understood how quickly ordinary moments can become precious. A photograph of my family suddenly appeared in my mind. It was one we had taken during a weekend together. Grace was standing beside me, smiling, while the children were making ridiculous faces because they hated standing still for photographs. I wondered whether I would ever see them again. I pushed the thought away. Not yet. I couldn't allow myself to think like that. There were hundreds of people behind us who had trusted us enough to close their eyes, fall asleep, watch movies, eat meals, or simply stare out of their windows without worrying about anything. Some of them were probably traveling to see their families. Some were going on business trips. Some were returning home after months away. There might even have been someone on that aircraft who had just gotten married, someone attending a funeral, someone meeting their child for the first time, or someone who had no idea that their life might be hanging in the balance. I couldn't think about all of them individually. I had to fly the aircraft. The cockpit became strangely quiet except for the alarms and the voices between me and my co-pilot. We worked together, checking one system after another. At one point, I looked down at the controls and realized that my palms were sweating. That had never happened to me before during a serious flight. I wiped my hand against my uniform and continued. Then the aircraft jolted. It wasn't the kind of turbulence passengers complain about after landing. This was different. The movement was sudden enough to make my stomach drop. I tightened my grip. The nose of the aircraft wasn't behaving the way I wanted it to. I made another adjustment. For a moment it responded. Then another warning appeared. My co-pilot said something to me, but I barely heard him. I was completely focused. There was no room for fear. There was no room for anger. There was no room for wondering why this was happening. But then I heard a sentence from my wife in my mind. It was something she had told me months earlier after we had been discussing religion. She had looked at me and said, "Hassan, you don't have to be afraid of asking God the truth." At the time, I had smiled and changed the subject. Now those words came back to me. I don't know why. I didn't want them there. I was fighting to keep an aircraft in the sky, and somehow my wife's voice had become louder in my mind than the alarms surrounding me. I remember whispering, "Not now," but the thought wouldn't leave. The aircraft began losing altitude. My co-pilot immediately called it out. I checked the instruments again. The numbers were changing. I could feel the seriousness of the situation spreading through the cockpit. I knew exactly what it meant. We were no longer dealing with a minor technical problem. We were fighting to keep hundreds of people alive. I reached for the radio again. "Mayday, mayday." I tried to transmit our situation. Static. I tried again. Nothing. I could hear my own breathing. For the first time in my career, I felt completely alone in that cockpit. Then the aircraft dropped suddenly. My stomach rose into my throat. Somewhere behind us, I knew passengers must have been frightened. Perhaps people were screaming. Perhaps parents were holding their children. Perhaps someone was praying. And then something happened inside me that I will never forget. I stopped thinking about being a pilot. I stopped thinking about my reputation. I stopped thinking about what people would say about me if I died. I simply thought about going home. I wanted to see Grace. I wanted to hear my children arguing over something stupid. I wanted to sit at my mother's table and listen to her complain that I was too thin. I wanted one more ordinary morning. Just one. I looked at the instruments again. The aircraft was still descending. And deep inside, I knew we might not have much time left. I don't even remember the exact moment when everything went black. There was no dramatic countdown, no final sentence between the pilots, no warning that said, "This is the end." One moment I was staring at the instruments, trying desperately to keep the aircraft under control, and the next moment, everything disappeared. The alarms stopped. The voices stopped. The shaking stopped. Even my own breathing seemed to disappear. At first, I thought I had simply lost consciousness for a few seconds. But then I realized something strange. I wasn't in the cockpit anymore. I wasn't falling. I wasn't afraid. I was simply there. I can't explain where there was. There was no floor beneath my feet, but I wasn't falling. There was no ceiling above me, yet I didn't feel exposed. Everything around me seemed incredibly peaceful. I had never experienced silence like that in my entire life. And then I saw the light. It wasn't the kind of light that hurts your eyes when you look directly at it. It was warm, gentle, almost alive. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, yet I couldn't find a source. The strangest thing was what I felt. Peace. Complete peace. The kind of peace I had never experienced during prayer, during vacations, during family gatherings, or even on the quietest nights of my life. There was no fear, no pain, no concern about my family. For a brief moment, I wondered if I was dreaming. Then I heard a voice. Hassan. I froze. The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It felt as though the words were being spoken directly into my heart. I turned around, and I saw him. Even now, years later, I struggle to describe what I saw without feeling like my words are too small. I knew who he was before anyone told me. Jesus. The name I had heard from my wife countless times. The name I had heard in churches, on television, in conversations with Christians, and in the Bible that Grace occasionally left on our dining table. But seeing him was different. He wasn't the caricature I had created in my mind. He wasn't angry. He wasn't looking at me with hatred because I had rejected him. He looked at me with a kind of love that I didn't know how to process. I stood there completely overwhelmed. The first thought that entered my mind was, I'm dead. And somehow I knew it was true. I wanted to ask what had happened to the aircraft. I wanted to ask about my wife. I wanted to know whether my children were alive. But before I could speak, Jesus looked at me. And I felt as though he already knew every question inside me. Then he said something I will never forget. You have spent your life trying to understand God without knowing his heart. Those words broke something inside me. I immediately thought about every argument I had ever had with Grace. Every time she had tried to tell me about Jesus. Every time I had dismissed her. Every time I had told her that I already knew God and didn't need another faith. I thought about how confident I had been. I thought I understood everything. But standing there, I suddenly realized how little I understood. I looked at Jesus and asked, why me? It wasn't a question about being special. I genuinely didn't understand why I was there. I was a Muslim pilot. I had spent my entire adult life believing that I knew where I stood with God. I had never expected to encounter Jesus like this. He didn't immediately answer. Instead, I felt something I had never felt before, a complete awareness of my own life. Not just the good parts. Everything. My kindness. My selfishness. My anger. My pride. The times I had hurt people and never apologized. The times I had been given opportunities to help someone and chose not to. The things I had hidden from everyone. It was as though I could suddenly see myself without the excuses I had spent years making. I felt ashamed. I lowered my head. I don't deserve to be here, I said. And then Jesus said, you are seeing yourself through your own eyes. I am showing you what mercy looks like. I began to cry. I don't know how long I stood there. Time didn't seem to exist. Then I thought about my family again. My wife, I said. My children. Jesus looked at me. They are not finished with you. Those words gave me hope. But then something happened that frightened me. The peaceful place around me began to fade. I heard a distant sound. At first it was barely noticeable. Then it became louder. A warning alarm. I looked around. The light seemed to move farther away. I didn't want to leave. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to feel completely safe. I looked at Jesus and said, please don't send me back. He didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at me. And in that moment, I understood something I had never understood before. My life wasn't being given back to me because I had earned it. It was being given back because I still had something to do. I thought of Grace. I thought of my children. I thought of my mother. And then I heard his voice one final time. Go back. Love them. Tell them what you have seen. And do not waste the life you have been given. The next thing I remember was pain. A terrible physical pain. My chest felt as though something enormous had landed on it. I tried to breathe. I couldn't. Then I heard shouting. Someone was calling my name. Hassan. Hassan. I opened my eyes. For several seconds, I had no idea where I was. Then everything came rushing back. The cockpit. The aircraft. The alarms. The passengers. The emergency. My co-pilot was beside me. And somehow, impossibly, I was alive. I looked at the instruments. The aircraft was still descending, but I was awake. And I knew that whatever happened next, I could never return to the man I had been before I closed my eyes. Because somewhere beyond that cockpit, beyond the clouds and beyond everything I thought I understood about death, I believed I had met Jesus, and he had sent me back. I was still trying to understand those words when reality came crashing back around me. The cockpit was loud again. Warning sounds were coming from different directions. My co-pilot was speaking quickly, and the aircraft was still descending. For a few seconds, I couldn't tell whether what I had just experienced had actually happened, or whether my mind had created it because I was terrified. Then I looked at my hands. They were shaking. I took a deep breath and looked at the instruments. I was alive. I was actually sitting in the cockpit again, and somehow I had regained enough awareness to continue doing the one thing I had been trained to do: fly. My co-pilot looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Are you okay? I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to say, I just saw Jesus. But the words wouldn't come out. Instead, I nodded and said, I'm okay. I wasn't okay. Something inside me had changed. I forced myself to concentrate on the aircraft. We continued working through the emergency, communicating as best we could, and doing everything possible to stabilize the situation. Every second seemed longer than the one before it. I kept thinking about my family, but strangely, I wasn't panicking anymore. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled me. I remembered the words I had heard. Go back. Love them. Tell them what you have seen. I didn't know what go back meant until I felt the aircraft begin to respond. The descent became more manageable. The situation was still serious, but there was finally a sense that we had a chance. I don't want to pretend that everything suddenly became easy. It didn't. We were still dealing with an emergency, and everyone in that aircraft had to remain focused until we were safely on the ground. Eventually, we reached a lower altitude. The aircraft stabilized enough for us to continue toward a safe landing. When the wheels finally touched the runway, I felt an emotion I had never experienced after landing before. Relief. Not the ordinary relief of finishing a long flight. This was different. I looked outside and saw the runway beneath us. We had made it. The passengers were alive. The crew was alive. I was alive. I sat there for a moment after the aircraft came to a complete stop, unable to move. My co-pilot said something to me, but I barely heard him. I lowered my head. Then I quietly whispered, "Thank you." I didn't even know exactly who I was thanking. For the first time in my life, I wasn't sure. When I eventually walked away from the aircraft, my legs felt weak. People were talking everywhere. Emergency personnel were moving around. Passengers were being helped out. Some were crying. Others were calling their families. I watched a man hug his wife. A young girl was crying while her father held her. An elderly woman sat on a bench with her hands covering her face. I couldn't stop looking at them. Every person I saw reminded me that I had almost watched an entire aircraft disappear. That night, when I finally got home, Grace opened the door. The moment she saw me, she knew something was wrong. She didn't ask about the aircraft first. She simply hugged me. I held her tightly. For several seconds, neither of us said anything. Then she pulled away and looked at me. Hassan, what happened? I wanted to tell her. I really did, but I was afraid she would think I was confused because of the emergency. I was afraid she would ask questions I couldn't answer. Most of all, I was afraid of saying the name that was burning inside my mind, Jesus. So I simply told her. It was a difficult flight. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said something that made my heart stop. You look like you've seen something. I didn't answer. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I remained awake. I sat alone in the living room with the lights turned off. The house was quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and the occasional sound of a car passing outside. I kept replaying the experience. The light, the peace, his voice. The way he looked at me. I tried to convince myself that it had been a hallucination. Maybe my brain had created the experience because I was under extreme stress. Maybe I had imagined Jesus because Grace was a Christian. Maybe all those years of hearing about Christianity had somehow planted the image in my subconscious. I wanted those explanations to be true. They would have made my life much easier. But one question wouldn't leave me alone. Why did he tell me to go back? I didn't have an answer. Over the next few days, I returned to work, but I wasn't the same person. My colleagues talked about the emergency. Some joked about how close we had come. Others discussed the technical details. There were reports to complete, questions to answer, and meetings to attend. I did everything I was supposed to do. But whenever I was alone, my mind went somewhere else. I began searching. At first, I didn't tell anyone. I used my phone late at night after Grace had fallen asleep. I typed questions into the search bar that I was almost embarrassed to write. Who is Jesus? What does Christianity say happens after death? Why do people see Jesus during near-death experiences? I read articles. I watched testimonies. I listened to Christians describe experiences that sounded strangely similar to mine. Sometimes I closed the page quickly because I felt uncomfortable. I didn't want to become a Christian. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. I simply wanted an explanation. One evening, I was sitting on our bed when I noticed Grace's Bible on the nightstand. I had seen that Bible hundreds of times, but that night it looked different. I picked it up. My hands actually trembled. I opened it and stared at the pages. I had never seriously read the Bible before. I knew some stories from childhood and had heard Christian teachings from my wife, but this was different. This time, I wasn't reading it because Grace asked me to. I was reading it because I had questions. I turned the pages slowly. Then I stopped. I read the words. I read them again. Something about them made me sit completely still. I can't say that I understood everything that night. I didn't. I had questions about Christianity. I had questions about Jesus. I had questions about my own beliefs. But as I sat there alone with that Bible in my hands, I realized something that frightened me more than the plane crash had. I wasn't searching for information anymore. I was searching for him. And for the first time in my life, I was beginning to wonder whether the man I had encountered beyond death had been waiting for me long before I ever knew his name. I didn't become a different man overnight. After opening that Bible, I spent weeks reading quietly, sometimes late at night after Grace and the children had gone to sleep. I had questions about almost everything. Some nights I would read for an hour and close the Bible feeling even more confused than when I started. Other nights, a single passage would stay in my mind until morning. But something was changing inside me. I began praying differently. Instead of simply asking God for the things I wanted, I started asking Him to show me the truth. I told Him honestly, God, if what I experienced was real, lead me. If Jesus really came to me, help me understand why. I didn't have all the answers. I still don't. but I knew I couldn't pretend nothing had happened. Grace noticed the change before anyone else did. One evening, she found me sitting at the dining table with her Bible open in front of me. She stopped in the doorway and stared at me. I looked up. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Then she smiled. It wasn't a triumphant smile. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't celebrate the fact that her husband was finally reading the Bible. She simply walked over, sat beside me, and held my hand. That meant more to me than she probably realized. I eventually told her everything. I told her about the aircraft. I told her about losing consciousness. I told her about the light. I told her about seeing Jesus and hearing him tell me to go back. And when I finished, Grace was crying. I asked her why. She wiped her face and said, "Because I've prayed for you for years." Then she looked at me and added, "But I never imagined God would answer that prayer like this." I began attending church with her. At first, I sat quietly at the back. I didn't know the songs. I didn't know when people were supposed to stand or sit. Sometimes everyone would say amen, and I would look around to see what I was supposed to do. I probably looked completely lost, but nobody made me feel unwelcome. People simply smiled at me. Over time, I began to understand what my wife had been trying to explain to me for years. Christianity was no longer just something Grace believed. It had become something I was personally investigating, questioning, and eventually embracing. When I finally accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, I cried. Not because I suddenly believed I had become perfect. I hadn't. I was still Hassan. I still made mistakes. I still lost my temper sometimes. I still worried about my children. I still had ordinary problems. But I had a peace I couldn't explain. And then came the difficult part. My family found out. My mother was heartbroken. She asked me many questions, and some conversations became emotional. She couldn't understand how her son, who had been raised Muslim, could suddenly say that he believed in Jesus. I told her I wasn't rejecting her. I wasn't rejecting my family. I wasn't trying to insult the faith she had taught me. I was simply telling her what had happened to me and what I had come to believe. Some relatives stopped speaking to me for a while. A few friends mocked me. Others thought the plane incident had affected my mind. One former colleague told me, "Hassan, you were under extreme pressure. Your brain was protecting you." I understood why he thought that. I didn't argue. I simply told him, "Maybe you are right, but I know what I experienced, and I cannot pretend it didn't happen." Even at work, I became more careful about discussing my faith. I didn't want to make people uncomfortable or turn my workplace into a religious debate. But outside work, I couldn't stay silent forever. I started speaking with some of my Muslim brothers, not as someone who believed he had all the answers, and certainly not as someone trying to attack them. I spoke to them as Hassan, as a man who had been where they were. I told them about my fear. I told them about the night I thought I was going to die. I told them about the peace I experienced. And most importantly, I told them about Jesus. Some listened, some argued with me, some laughed, some told me I had been manipulated by my Christian wife. I didn't become angry. I remembered something Grace had done for me years earlier. She had never forced me. She had never insulted my beliefs. She had simply kept showing me what she believed was the light. So I tried to do the same. To my Muslim brothers watching this, I want to say something from my heart. I am not telling you that you should hate your family. I am not telling you to become enemies with the people you love. I am not telling you to abandon kindness, respect, or compassion. I am simply asking you to seek God sincerely. Open the scriptures. Ask questions. Pray honestly. And if you are willing, ask Jesus to reveal himself to you. Because I spent most of my life believing I already knew everything I needed to know about God. Then, at 37,000 feet above the ground, When I thought my life was ending, everything I thought I knew was challenged. I also want to publicly thank my wife, Grace. For years, she tried to show me what she believed was the truth. And I ignored her. Sometimes I even became annoyed when she talked about Jesus. But she never stopped loving me. She never forced me. She prayed for me. She waited for me. She waited for me. And when I finally began searching, she didn't stand over me and say, "I told you so." She simply stood beside me. Grace, if you ever watch this, I want you to know that I finally understand what you were trying to show me. Thank you for loving me when I didn't understand. Thank you for praying when I wasn't listening. And thank you for pointing me toward Jesus. Today, whenever I enter an aircraft, I still do my job exactly as I was trained to do. I check the instruments. I follow procedures. I respect the responsibility of carrying people's lives through the sky. But I don't look at life the same way anymore. Every flight reminds me that we are not promised tomorrow. Every landing reminds me that another day is a gift. And every time I look at my wife and children, I remember how close I came to never seeing them again. The experience changed the way I speak to people. It changed the way I forgive. It changed the way I love my family. And most importantly, it changed the direction of my life. I don't know how much time I have left. None of us does. That's the message I believe Jesus sent me back to share. Don't wait until your final breath to start searching for God. Don't wait until everything falls apart. Don't wait until you are lying in a hospital bed. Don't wait until you are thousands of feet above the ground with nowhere left to run. Seek Him while you have time. Forgive while you can. Love your family while they are still beside you. And if you have questions about Jesus, don't be afraid to ask them. I was once the man who didn't want to hear. Now I'm the man who can't keep silent, because I believe I was given another chance. And I intend to spend whatever time I have left telling people about the one I believe gave it to me. Jesus saved my life in more ways than one.